So yeah, I'm excited to have Nat Chaney with us today. He's the assistant professor for hydrology and in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Duke University, where he's been since uh, 2018. He earned his undergraduate degree in applied mathematics and atmospheric science from UC Berkeley in 2010. Uh, Nate was subsequently completed his PhD in civil and environmental engineering at Princeton University in 2015 under supervision of the late Eric Wood, and that was followed by a postdoc research at the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory, working with Elena Shevrekova. In addition to his academic responsibilities, he's currently serving as the co-chair to the GWEX Glass panel. And today we're going to be talking to us about clustering heterogeneity and what it can do for land service models. So yeah, take it away, Nate.
Thank you so much. Let me go ahead and share and make sure that everything is working. Okay, are you seeing the full slide?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, are you seeing the different slide? Yes?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, hello everyone. My full name is Nathaniel. I tend to go by as Nate. And today I'm going to talk about a topic that's very dear to my heart. It's actually a lot of the premise behind a lot of the research that my group does. And it's this idea of clustering heterogeneity. And I'm going to focus it around giving some background of that might be familiar to some of you. But really, I want to pivot and talk about what we've been doing over the past 5 years to take this further in terms of improving land surface models. A lot of credit of this work is going to go to Laura, Daniel, and Joshua, who are either current PhD students or former PhD students in my lab. So the background of this that I always like to give is just take a step back and think about we're on Landsat and we're looking at the Earth and what do we see? And the amount of heterogeneity that you observe can be very pronounced. There's an example over Southwest California in the United States, and you see this zoom in into this 25 by 25 kilometer box. And in that 25-kilometer box, you've got the San Joaquin Valley on the west and the Sierra Nevadas on the east. And you immediately see the moisture differences. So there's a lot more precipitation happening in the Sierra Nevadas. And that moisture then is leading to more vegetation. There's groundwater that's being pushed down in San Joaquin Valley. There is the river recharge that's then leading down into the valley that is then providing water for the riparian zone where you see it a lot greener. And that's leading to agriculture. A lot of the population are living in that area. You have aspect playing a role, so north versus south facing slopes. So a lot of heterogeneity that comes in to explain our water, energy, carbons, and cycles, etc. So this is a question of how do we deal with this heterogeneity? Because as we think about the different processes, whether it's water, energy, carbon, etc., the fine scale matters, and it can matter quite a bit. Here's some examples. In the upper left this is a Ronnie Avasar, which is, you can think about it as the beginning of what we call mosaics or tiles within our land surface models, and just taking into account the fact that if you are a forest versus crops versus water, your energy flux, your energy balance can be quite different. Other classic ones from hydrology, think about hill slope hydrology, runoff generation, how much saturation is near the stream plays a big role in where that water goes. Does it infiltrate or does it go directly as a runoff? And also there's a lot of scales, so think about pore size, to field scale, to regional scale, to continental scale. All of these processes, these different scales play a role in the overall story. And of course, this is nothing new, right? So we've thought about this within our hydrological land surface models for decades, longer than I've been alive. We've been thinking about this problem. And here's an example of a climate model or system model where we have the 25-kilometer box, and inside of it we have all this heterogeneity, and we think about this as the subgrid problem. We think about how do we actually account for that heterogeneity, and we come up with subgrid parameterizations. And then that leads to being put inside the model, and this is a part of weather prediction, of climate prediction, and other offline applications of land surface models. So I give that as a background to motivate what I'm going to be talking about here. So the first thing I want to do is ask the question of how can we leverage clustering to revisit the discretization of the land surface. And for those of you that are familiar with my group's research over the past 10 years, a lot of this will be familiar to you. But the new one, the other one I want to talk about is what opportunities does leveraging discretization via clustering present for land surface models? So what does it actually give us in terms of process representation that we couldn't do necessarily before? I'll start off with the first one. And where I start with this is going back to Friese and Harlan 1969, whereas it's the dream of everything and everywhere. We want to predict all these different cycles at very high resolutions, both spatial and temporally everywhere. And so we create these very fine meshes, and we want to be able to model this everywhere on the globe. The challenge with this is, you think about it as a fully distributed sense, is that there is enormous model structure uncertainty, parameter uncertainty, forcing uncertainty. And so to do any of this correctly and think about it from a forecasting perspective, you need to account for the uncertainties as well. So the computational load of this, as well as all those uncertainties, have always led us to think about the alternative. How can we actually simplify this problem? How can we take this heterogeneity concept and reduce it to something that is more computationally tractable and efficient? So this is a paper by Christoph Peters Ladar from 2017, which is based on one that Eric Wood did back in late 80s, early 90s, that shows this paradigm of distributed model versus lump model. So on the left-hand side is distributed model. This is basically taking every grid cell and modeling every grid cell, let's say 1 meter, 30 meters, 100 meters, with how you think about parameterizations within that as well, but at a much higher resolution. And you're starting to get to explicitly represent, think about riparian zones. And the other side of it is lump model. So now you're taking your 25-kilometer box and just turning it all into basically a single parameterization with really no subgrid information represented, or if it is, it's minimal. So finding the sweet spot between those two has been really what's been sought out for in hydrologic models through what we call semi-distributed modeling. And in land surface models, we've done this via tiling. So what we call mosaic tiling, we're really looking for that sweet spot of, okay, we can't model every single grid cell at 10 meters within our weather prediction model, but we can do some sort of clustering or some kind of histogram within it of different land cover types, soil types, etc. But a lot of this from a hydrologic perspective can be seen as, why is this a good idea? Why does this work? Well, you think about that map you see in the lower left, you can think about environmental characteristics. And you think about grouping things together. You can think about uplands versus lowlands. You can think about riparian versus non-riparian, trees versus grasses, north versus south, natural versus managed, steep versus flat. So think about ways in which you differentiate these different regions within this grid cell. And the hypothesis goes, and it is generally proven, there's evidence that indeed this does happen, that if you have similar environmental characteristics, and if you know enough of those similar environmental characteristics, then you can think about you're going to get a similar hydrologic response. So if everything that you're getting, everything is the same soils, you're at the same place on the hill slope, you're in the same elevation, in the same latitude, longitude generally, and you're getting the same microclimate, then you can think about that they're behaving in similar ways. And there's this idea that was behind ideas of hydraulic similarity within hydrology, where you think about different sources of heterogeneity, proxies of heterogeneity, and you come up with synthesis approaches. In our land surface modeling world, we think about univariate distributions, so that is the idea of tiles. You can think about taking elevation data within a grid cell and subdividing into elevation bands. The Vic model, they started doing that back in the 90s. The top model approach, which is a classic hydrologic model, uses the topographic index, which is accounting for slope and accumulation area, to arrive at hydrologic units. And then you can think about just simply superimposing GIS layers, and this comes to what we call as the classic hydraulic response units, or HRUs. But basically all of them are trying to get this idea of how do you summarize heterogeneity in a simple way to be able to account for what matters, but not overdoing the computation. And then these ideas then are fed into our hydrologic and land surface models. Just show you an idea of what these things look like. The topographic index, again, this is the combination of slope and accumulation area. The elevation bands, you're just basically discretizing your elevation into different units. The mosaic, so you effectively take the high resolution land cover map and think about creating a histogram from it. And then your classic hydrologic response unit, so you have your different watersheds or hill slopes or units that you define as, and then within that it'll be mostly lumped. So back when I started thinking about this, this would be over 10 years ago at this point, one of the things that motivated me is how do we merge all these concepts? Is there a way to merge these different ideas? Because they're all trying to get at the same thing, which is basically taking heterogeneity and summarizing it and creating units that are representative. And so this is where the idea of leveraging clustering in this problem comes. So we have all this data from satellites that tells us something about the heterogeneity of the system at different resolutions. So can we actually just cluster this information and use that as a way to arrive at these units, at these hydrologic response units, or however we want to call them? We call them tiles. I'm just going to use them as clusters because it's the general way to think about them. Another way to see this is you can think about all of our data that we're getting, the spatial data, has a lot of information, a lot of it's noise for what we actually need to represent our processes. And the clustering, you can see it as a way of squeezing out the orange juice. So you're really trying to get the signal from the noise in all of it. And it's an efficient way to do that. So within the idea of clustering, it's an unsupervised learning. What is the concept here? So we have all these proxies of heterogeneity. You can think about topography, you can think of elevation, you can think about soil properties, and you can think about in the context of partitioning this n-dimensional space, where that space is defined by the number of covariates proxies that you want to account for in your clustering, and then use that to partition into different clusters, which is going to be our representative units that we're going to include in our model. I'll talk about the approach that we do with k-means, which is the brute force, most naive way of doing it. But we've also explored using other methods as well, such as agglomerative clustering, which can give also interesting results. But as I said, for the purpose of this talk, it's primarily around k-means. So to give an idea from just a general sense of what's going on here, imagine we have these two maps, and this is high resolution maps of elevation and slope, and put them on a scatter plot. So x-axis elevation, y-axis is slope, as you see in the lower left. And then we just take a k-means clustering, we predefine an end, say 10, and then out comes this diagram where it's basically separating these into points. And so each now pixel is being assigned to a cluster. Now, one question that might come to mind is what happens with the pixels that are really close to each other. And in the classic k-means, we can't really do much about that. But we have explored also uncertainty, adding uncertainty about this of how close you are to one cluster centroid to another, etc. But I won't be talking about that within this talk. But the main story then is that then you have this assignment of clusters to each of these pixels, and then you can actually map this back out in space. So you can say, okay, you belong to this given cluster, given the properties that you have. And we're going to call these, I'm going to call them clusters. In the classic land surface model, and you can think about this as recasting the tiling problem as clusters. You can think about, in more hydrology, recasting the hydrologic response units also as clusters. All these clusters are a little bit different because they can be more spatially abstract, spatially disconnected from each other. So just because you're in the same cluster does not mean that you are geographically next to each other. You have all the pixels within a cluster exactly right next to each other. They can actually be in different places, which is actually an advantage for us, as I'll talk about later in the talk. So it's pretty simple to then take this the next step and just extend this to an n-dimensional space. So we have all these different layers, so elevation, slope, saturated hydraulic conductivity, temperature, go all the way down. And obviously you don't need to stop here, you can keep going. And you take they take the k-means clustering, and what comes up with is on the right. This is just an example of this. So now you have the different aspects emerging in this. So with simply 10 different clusters, you can come up with this different map, or this map of what all this space could look like. One thing that I will add to this is you can take also dimensionality reduction ideas. So you can take a principal component analysis and first take that space, that part of the n-dimensional space, and reduce it down to more principal components that are informing us about most of the information, about most of the information content in it. You can do a feature selection and figure out what of these actually matter. So there's a lot of ways you can play with this. But generally, the idea still is you take us all this information, and you're going to reduce it somehow into this finite number of clusters. And want the number of clusters to be substantially lower than the number of pixels in that domain, because that's how you get the massive computational gains. So that was the origin of the 2016 paper in hydroblocks, and the results from that were that simply clustering and thinking about the hydraulic cycle of lateral connectivities, it kind of worked and it kind of did not. And so what we realized quickly is that we had to bring more of the geomorphology into the question, into this problem. So how we did this was basically take elevation. Now we actually pre-compute hill slopes or watersheds. In this case, it was hill slopes, but the most recent work is actually just working directly with watersheds. And then we actually cluster those hill slopes themselves. So we learn some behavior or properties of those hill slopes and from the environmental data that we have. And then we also do K-means clustering, and then we come up with a map of characteristic hill slopes. And the latest implementation of this is a more generalizable approach where you're thinking about this hierarchy, this multi-scale approach of you have your domain, your regular grid domain that we're going to have in most of our models. It can be structured or unstructured. And here I'm going to call those basically macro scale polygons. So these grid cells don't need to be exact squares or rectangles. They can be amorphous polygons. And then what you do is you take your information, you have your watersheds, and you cluster those watersheds into a finite number of watersheds as a function of the properties that you learn from the environmental data. Then you take those clusters of watersheds and you divide them into height bands. Basically, you discretize according to the height above nearest drainage area, nearest drainage. And then that gives you a discretization of these clusters of watersheds that's assigned now to each of these basins. Then the last step then is within a given height band, you then take all the information that you had from soils and from land cover, and you then cluster that as well. And so now the naive brute force k-means is happening, but it's happening within these height bands. But within this hierarchy now you have watersheds. Within those watersheds now you have the hill slope discretization, and within the hill slope discretization now you have the sub-heterogeneity happening within those height bands. And all that together then leads to this map of clusters for a given macroscale polygon or grid cell. I will say what happened here is, if you see in the upper right with the tiles or clusters, is you can see it doesn't really follow the regular grid, because we actually, even though we start with a regular grid, we let that grid change so that we don't want to break up watersheds. We want to minimize breaking up watersheds. And so we let the watersheds come in or go out as a function of where most of the area of a watershed is in respect to the actual grid cell. So all of that coming together leads to basically a fancy way of creating tiles. And here I call them clusters. But basically what the model still sees is primarily, it only needs to see the histogram, the distribution of clusters with associated properties, meteorology, and interconnections. I'm not talking about it here, but you can also think about taking the high resolution meteorology on an offline sense. If you have like a 3 kilometer, 4 kilometer radar product, rainfall radar, and basically figuring out, given your clusters within the grid cell, the pixels that belong to it, what is the appropriate meteorology for that cluster? And then you can have a cluster unique meteorology instead of relying on the macro scale means. But long story short, then all that information can then go into these models. So HydroBlocks is the one that we develop at Duke. Then a lot of those ideas are implemented at GFDL, where it's now put into their climate model and their system models. And then other implementations of the models like SUMA, CLM with the hill slopes. All these models are able to a certain extent, leverage these concepts, and they already are. Okay, so that is the background of clustering, and that was meant to be able to set the stage for what I want to talk for the rest of this time about, which is what opportunities do clustering-based discretization approaches present for land surface models? So obviously this makes pretty maps, and we're able to use clustering. But what does it actually do for us in terms of representing processes that we couldn't necessarily do before? So the motivation behind this and the background of what I'm going to be talking about is that the clusters, it should be clear by now, but they have a geographic meaning. So when we tend to think about tiles and land surface models, we just tend to think about these abstract concepts that only have a percentage of the grid cell, and we forget about it. But in this context, these clusters have been defined from all the environmental data. We have all the processing steps. So we have a map of this 30-meter pixel belongs to this cluster, and that one belongs to that cluster. And this is actually extremely useful for many reasons. So the most obvious one from a applications perspective is the ability to map this one-to-many mapping. So if you have 10, 20, 30 clusters in your model, and you have actually 100,000 pixels at the fully distributed, if you're going to run it fully distributed, you can actually take your 30 clusters and you have a single time step of evapotranspiration. You take the corresponding pixels that belong to that cluster and you can map it out in space. And so now you actually have the field scale estimates. So that is one application of that idea. The other one is you can assess the level of simulated heterogeneity that is being represented. So it allows us also within a field scale estimate, as we have all these subgrid parameterizations, it allows us to give a more objective way to figure out if how we're thinking about the subgrid is actually representative of what's actually happening or not. And the last one is introducing cluster interconnectivity parameterizations. And this now goes to process representation. And the motivation behind this has to do again with the fact that all of this map of clusters, each pixel now belongs to a cluster. So if a pixel is next to another pixel, so if a pixel in cluster 1 is next to a pixel in cluster 2, and you know that one can flow from one to the other, it actually tells you that cluster 1 can flow into cluster 2. And I'll talk about that more in detail. So the different themes that I want to talk about, and I've only got 4 or 5 slides for each of them. One is going to be cluster river coupling. So how do we rethink multi-scale river routing within our models with these concepts? The other one is subsurface lateral flow, which was actually in many ways the beginning of a lot of these concepts of why we went down this route to begin with. And then another one that we're looking into a lot right now is thinking about lower boundary layer lateral transport. And basically in the first 100 meters, how does the wind push around different tracers? So with the first one, so rethinking multi-scale river routing, what I'm showing up there in the upper left is that idea of macroscale polygon. So remember that hierarchy of multivariate clustering. So you have your clusters of basins, now you have your height bands, and you have your sub-height band heterogeneity. But here what I'm doing is I have this cluster of basins, and on top of that, then I'm superimposing the explicit river network. And this is a vector river network, so basically each watershed basin has its own reach. And in the extreme case where the number of clusters of watersheds equals the number of watersheds that are contained within that grid cell, then it's going to be a one-to-one mapping. But then you reach the case in the more abstract concept of, let's say you only have 5 clusters of watersheds. So basically you have a lot of watersheds that belong to cluster 1, a lot of watersheds that belong to cluster 2, etc. Then you have to think about connecting those two. So you can have this river routing scheme, and then on top of that, you can have your clusters of watersheds with all of the mechanics that I just described. So in this 2021 paper, what we did is we think about this two-way coupling. So you have this river routing scheme. In this case, it's that one was an implicit scheme. The most recent version is actually a Lagrangian particle tracker. But basically, you have reaches of clusters of watersheds, and at the end of a time step, each of those reaches has a certain stage height of the floodplain of where the water is. And then you can actually group those according to the watersheds that belong to a given cluster of watershed. And you arrive at a characteristic floodplain for that given time step. And then that interacts with land surface. So you feed that in, those height bands now that belong to that are fed in with the basically ponding on top of it. You're able to recalculate each of those height bands to account for the surface fluxes, etc. And then you now have a difference in inundation height per height band. And you can then scale that to the individual reaches. And so you're able to account for that in the routing model. So there's this two-way coupling that's happening between this vector river routing, which is explicit, every reach is represented, and this more abstract clustering of heterogeneity. This allows for hill slope stream interactions in very computationally efficient ways. So you can think about ephemeral streams in this context. So you're able to move away from predefined lake tiles. So you can think about lakes growing and dying. You can basically place reservoirs and those things can emerge. And that is work that we're actively looking into right now within my group. You can move to flooding tiles, merging and splitting, and this has also implications for water management, so surface water abstraction. So and that allows us a way to interconnect what we think about as tiles, classically as tiles, formally with river routing at that subgrid level. What does this do for us? So here is from this study. This had 4 macroscale polygons in this case, and which are basically represented by those grid cells. And what I'm showing here then is uncoupled. So this is, you just have your classic, the rivers are basically pipes that don't interact. They just receive water from the land surface, but never actually feed anything back. And the one on the right is you actually allow this two-way coupling between the land surface clusters and the river routing scheme. And then you're actually able to get recharge, and you start to see the soil moisture maps that are closer to what we'd expect in terms of the role that the rivers are having in refilling the land surface. So that is, in the context of river routing, what that opens, the clustering ideas allow us to think about. The other one that I want to touch on is subsurface lateral interactions. In many ways, this is as I said, this is the beginning of where all of these clustering ideas, when I started them, came from. So for those of you that are familiar with top model, which is a classic hydrologic model, it's based on topographic indices, which is basically this idea of hydraulic similarity. And that idea is basically if you have slope and accumulation area, it tells you something about where the water is going to flow. So with hydroblocks, what we're trying to do is basically take that idea and generalize it into this clustering concept. And so here's an idea on the left where you have, imagine you're on the ridge, which is cluster 1, and then if you think that it's a steepest descent, that's the way the water is going to follow, then cluster 1, water in the subsurface in cluster 1 is going to fall into clusters 2 and clusters 3. Cluster 2 is going to go into cluster 4 and cluster 5, etc. So that was the origin, and the update of that is in 2021. And then that idea was also implemented within GFDL, more in the characteristic hill slope idea. So this lateral interconnectivity between clusters can be represented in a very simple way. So imagine again that we have this a map of clusters. So this pixels at 30 meters or 100 meters or whatever resolution the highest proxy that you're using is at. And we have this elevation, and then we figure out, given the pixels, that this one, given topography, is going to flow into that one. So then you can actually sum it up and say this amount of pixels of cluster 3 are going to flow into cluster 2, etc. So you're able to construct basically a flow matrix where you're able to think about which direction the water would flow as a function of the pixel location from the clustering. And think about this in terms of like hill slope processes. And very simply, if you do this, and this is only using 3 clusters, you have up at the ridge, you end up with lower soil moisture because it's being basically redistributed down to the valley to the riparian zone that's being recharged. which leads to higher latent heat fluxes and lower sensible heat fluxes. So then the question we've been exploring over the past 3 years is, what if we take a multi-scale approach to address lateral subsurface dynamics from hill slope to continental extent? So instead of just staying within the hill slope idea, what if we think about intermediate to regional flows? So to give some more background of this, if you think about groundwater, it's not just a hill slope problem. It's also interactions between catchments, between watersheds, and it's also think about mountain ranges flowing into the plains type of idea. So you have to think about the entire large system if we're going to model all the different parts. So in this multi-scale approach, we can break it into a local, intermediate, and regional flows, or at least that's how we're thinking about it in the context of hydroblocks. And the one that's been there, it's been developed and implemented in a lot of our models, is basically this idea of a hill slope. There we have these height bands, and we have a way to simulate how height band 3 flows into height band 2 using a Darcy flow, or it can also just be simply driven by topography exclusively. But what I'm trying to think about here is actually thinking about now not just the flow, the subsurface flow between height bands within my hill slope, but I'm also going to think about the subsurface flow between my clusters of watersheds. So I have these clusters of basins, and I want to think about how all these basins are basically, which are they connected to. So if I have this given watershed that belongs to cluster of basin 1, and this one belongs to cluster of basin 2, well, I know that they're interconnected, and so they have this interface. And I can leverage that interface to actually then come up also with a connectivity matrix. So what I'm showing here is, here are the macroscale polygons. We name this these different units, the regional, intermediate, subsurface flow units, or RISFUs. And those allow for this to account for this interconnectivity. And so how we think about the intermediates, and it's just simply as a definition as we used here. Intermediates in this context is basically flows between clusters of watersheds happening within a grid cell or within a macroscale polygon. And then regional is then flows of clusters of basins happening between macroscale polygons. So it stitches together this whole interconnectivity happening, not just in the local hill slope scale, but also between catchments within the grid cell, but also over the entire domain, because now these catchments are connected across macroscale polygons. It's important to note here, what we're not doing is we're not averaging up to the macroscale polygon and then connecting the macroscale polygon basically via subsurface flow. We're actually connecting the clusters of basins of one macroscale polygon to the cluster of basins from another macroscale polygon. So it's at a finer connectivity that's happening. So the two units that are happening here of scales are going to be at the local and then at the catchment level. But the separation between in-grid cell and between grid cell is what distinguishes, in our definition, the intermediate and regional. So what this looks like, combine all these two together. If I am a cluster that is basically, I have my one-dimensional Richards equation that I'm using on that given cluster within my grid cell. I have my Darcy flux, my vertical Darcy flux, but I'm also adding a bunch of terms. I'm basically adding a bunch of divergence terms. One is the local one, which is coming from my hill slope, so how things are moving in or out as a function of the hill slope, but I'm also adding two other terms. One is an intermediate flow. So based on the catchments that are around me, what is the divergence, and the regional as well. So it allows us a way to account for these different sources in this multi-scale approach of information in updating my land surface model. So here's an example. This is in the paper by Danielle in 2026 that came out beginning of this year. And an example of Colorado where we're doing local, intermediate, and regional, divided into that domain. So think about those different macro scale polygons. And what he's showing here basically is the divergence, 1 year hourly average for, and looking at the different basically scales. So local would be that the hill slope, and in this case, a negative divergence, which is in blue because basically you have an accumulation because it's basically a convergence. You can't see it here, but if you look very closely, you'll see that there's a very dark blue basically at the rivers, or at the streams. So you have the convergence happening next to the streams, and you have the divergence happening more towards along the hill slope, as you'd expect. And then you have the intermediate flows where you now have water flowing between catchments. In this case, what I actually see is the water flowing from the catchments that are higher up to those catchments that are lower down in lower part of the domain. So now you have that interconnectivity as well as regional. But the main story here is that this provides a framework to be able to think about this multi-scale subsurface problem in a very simple way that allows us to keep the computation very much reduced, but be able to account for these different scales. Okay, and for the last one I want to talk about is boundary layer transport. And this one is one that we started probably a couple years ago, and we're actively working on this one. And so the idea goes like this. If you have a wind field and you superimpose that wind field on top of your map of clusters, the pixels of their 30-meter pixels, well, you can think about if you have let's say a fixed wind speed going in one direction, you can think about this cluster will flow into that cluster as a function of where the pixels are in space. And that's kind of what I'm showing here. Where basically, if you superimpose this wind field, which is going diagonal across this catchment, you're going to see that these different clusters are going to interact. You're going to have cluster 6 flow into 5, but then you'll also have cluster 5 flow into 6. But you will have a net one way or another. So you can leverage this idea to think about tracer redistribution happening between these clusters. So clusters connections can vary with wind direction. So this is learned in the pre-processing from what we call these cluster maps. And what are the applications of this? And this is one that I'm especially excited about here in the next few years. So this can apply to think about seed propagation between clusters, between tiles, not just between clusters within a grid cell, but between clusters, not just in grid cells, but between grid cells as well. You can think about dust emission, nutrient transport, blowing snow. You can even think about fire, although you have to be very careful here now, I think, with all of these with turbulence as well. You think about advection of heat and moisture. And so now you're thinking about also the context of the coupling in itself. So then all of this comes together to be able to allow for more lateral connectivity that's emerging in the whole system within a grid cell. So this problem is a little more interesting, a little harder than the subsurface one, because the subsurface one, the scales at which the water is moving is slow enough that you can make the assumption that water is really not going to flow past a club. So it's going from cluster 1 to cluster 2. It's not going to make its way to cluster 3 if it's flowing through cluster 2 within that time step. But in the context of boundary layer transport, and also case in the river routing, if you have a 30-minute time step, your tracer can go from cluster 1 and end up in cluster 5 or cluster 10, or it can even end up in a different grid cell. So it can traverse multiple clusters before that 30-minute time step is over. So in this case, Joshua, who is a fifth-year PhD student in my group, she developed this scheme we call Lagrangian-based cluster connectivity matrix, LCCM transport scheme. And basically the idea is that we're just creating a tracker that's saying if I start in cluster 1, I have a certain time step, delta t, and I'm going to figure out how much of it ends up in cluster 5 and cluster 4. So I can pre-calculate a connectivity matrix that already knows that if I start in cluster 1 at a given time step, given this wind field, I'm going to end up in clusters 4 and 5. What this looks like in terms of the map of clusters is this connectivity matrix you see on the right is based on the one on the left. So here we have a north to south flow happening, where now think about it as cluster 1 is flowing into clusters 2 and 5. Cluster 3 is flowing into clusters 2, 7, and 4. And you can see it in that way. On the right-hand side, you're seeing that represented. Because of the time step, I think this is around roughly 5 minutes. This is a case where if you see cluster 5, it's not just flowing into cluster 8. Cluster 5 is actually, 75% of it is actually leaving. So it's going to up, which means it's basically leaving the entire grid cell entirely, because the time step is large enough that it actually just skips over some of these clusters. So if a tracer starts in a given cluster, given the wind map, the particle tracker predetermines which clusters the tracer ends up in at the end of the time step. And so we've implemented this over a test domain in Montana. We actually use now a 3 kilometer wind field coming from Wharf. And we did 3 implementations of this. So there's the baseline Lagrangian particle tracker, so just a classic LPT. And we initialized the entire domain with basically uniform concentration of a tracer. And we see how it evolves over this 3-hour time step. And so the LPT in this case is going to be the baseline or the quote unquote ground truth. And then we have an upwind scheme, which is an Eulerian approach, which is highly numerically diffusive. And then the cluster approach is LCCM. And so all that I'm trying to show here now is we did this at the cluster of basins level. So we did not take this down all the way down to the height bands or the sub-tiles within a height band. But we just did it at the characteristic basin scale. And what we're able to show basically is if you take LPT as the ground truth, in reality this LCCM, which is extremely more computationally efficient, that's able to leverage this cluster, is actually able to do a pretty good job at redistributing this tracer. And so that work is still ongoing. There's a lot more to do there. There's a paper currently in preparation, but it is my opinion that those concepts have a lot of potential for when we think about connectivities, not just in the subsurface, but also in the atmosphere within our land surface models. Some final thoughts. So clustering heterogeneity, this is an ability to effectively and efficiently represent surface multi-scale heterogeneity. Hopefully I was able to show that. And then in the second half of the presentation, I was trying to show how this opens up new paths to think about how we parameterize or model multi-scale processes in our models. And there's a lot of opportunity within the context of lateral connectivity. So that's at the end of that. I need to do a shameless plug. We have the Panglass conference here coming up in less than 2 months, and we're very excited to see many of you there. And if someone has not submitted an abstract or not registered yet and is still interested, please do so. There are already more than 200 abstracts, and we're very excited to see everyone there. So with that, thank you so much. I'll stop sharing, but I'm happy to share again if there are specific questions about it.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. It's really, really interesting. There's a good amount of people in the audience, but I think we can actually have interactive discussions. So if you do have a question, please don't hesitate to raise your hand and then we can let you talk. There's already a question by Gianpaolo. Do you want to ask your question live?
Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, yes. So great talk. It's really interesting approach. And I was wondering, my question concerned the clustering method and how deep into the soil you apply it. So for instance, whether you consider the clusters having consistent soil hydrology to the vegetation above or whatever is above in the cluster, or at which point do you stop clustering into the soil?
Yeah, so obviously this is a subjective decision to the person who's doing the clustering. So we've done multiple iterations of this. The basic solution, the basic answer would be we basically take a representative porosity or KSAT and KSAT of the first 2 meters and use that in the clustering exercise. So if you have high enough resolution soil properties, then you can do that. You can also, if you have more like a geologic information, parent material, you can use that as well. So I think that the answer would be you can use whatever you want to use is the answer. There's no real limitation of that. But what we're limited by is the data that's available. And what we were using at that stage was basically 2-meter soil data.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot.
Yep.
We also have a question from Marvin. I don't know if you also would like to ask your question live.
I can also just read it.
Yeah, no, I don't want to put everyone on the spot.
Yeah. So Marvin was asking, do these tools and applications detect pollution sources at river corridors? What I will say is that because you have this ability to do the high resolution in the subgrid, it allows you to account for tracers at fine resolutions. So although we haven't specifically done that in that context, it certainly would be possible.
Great. Any more questions? I won't put everyone on the spot. You can also just type your question in the box or otherwise raise your hand. I think Jean-Paolo has a follow-up question. Go ahead.
A follow-up question. I might have missed it, but if I understood correctly, the exchange between clusters can also jump a grid box, right? So you can have
Yes.
a cluster going into another grid box. How do you handle that? Because it's I can imagine for river hydrology that can be quite challenging.
Yeah, so this is a fun question. So in the river routing one, so we have it's basically a Lagrangian particle tracker is how we do it. So the velocities are we have a kinematic wave to define the velocities. But basically, because this is also a parallelization question as well. So each reach within a given grid cell knows via pre-processing what are the reaches downstream that it could possibly reach if the flow is going at 10 meters per second. So basically, you establish a max, and you can say you could theoretically end up in this grid cell over here in that reach. And so using that, you're able to set up a system that is able to leverage all that information. It's fed back to the reach, and then it basically just pushes it down, and then it sends that information over to the other grid cell. This is a really hard concept to explain in 30 seconds, but the point is that we have thought about it. It is possible. We do have it working. We have it working for the river routing scheme. We have it working for the multi-scale subsurface scheme. We haven't done it for the boundary layer one yet because that's still in early stages, but it is definitely computationally feasible to do, and it does not lead to multiple iterations, which tends to happen in a lot of these schemes because of cross grid cell interactions.
Awesome, thanks a lot, mate.
Yep.
Any more questions? Don't be shy to put them in the chat if you don't want to put your hand up. So yeah, I don't know if you covered it. You mentioned that k-means is the ones that you've been using, but you've tried other clustering algorithms as well. Like, what was the kind of?
Hello.
Oh, sorry.
Yes. Yeah. So we did Marvin, do you want to say something?
Yes, I'm actually asking the questions because right now I am finishing my master's in sustainable architecture, and my research study is about sustainable river corridor management. And I'm going to investigate the relationship of infrastructures to the river systems. So that's the reason why I'm asking whether the tools and applications you have used can be utilized in checking this.
Yeah.
Checking pollution.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, although it has not been used with that application yet, definitely the infrastructure that's inside of these types of models, these types of ideas, these concepts, they can use that. So you can think about river pollution, and I guess the advantage of it is you're able to think about the fine scale, 30 meter, 100 meter river scales in a computationally efficient way within large models. So the answer is yes, it is possible, but it's not currently implemented.
And also my next question would be, I would like to see historical data in 5 years just to compare um, the magnitude of the pollution that is going to the river systems.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not entirely familiar with that area, so I wouldn't know exactly how to answer it. But if there is information, it could certainly be used to evaluate the model.
Thank you, Nate.
You're welcome. To get to your question, Nina, so yeah, we did k-means. We've played around with agglomerative clustering. We've done some spectral clustering ideas. We've played around with dimensionality reduction, with ideas of principal component analysis as a way. Generally, the story has been it it does lead to different results, but we always just end up going back to k-means because the improvements that you're getting in terms of the story is not that substantial for it to make a strong argument for doing the extra computation on it. And so generally what I have merged over into and over the years is basically, and there's a paper we did on this 3 years ago, where you're basically converging on what are the optimal features. So you figure out, okay, here are the features. I am going to keep reducing them until I get the right features that I need for my problem, right? So you do basically a convergence analysis. And one thing I did not talk about here is one of the key things that we explore is what is the number of clusters that you actually need. So is it 10? Is it 100? And it very much depends on where you are. So you can do a convergence analysis per grid cell to figure out that optimality. And obviously different clustering approaches lead to different results, but it's not that much better than k-means is what I've learned over the years.
Interesting.
Yep.
And I guess another one, so what kind of additional data do you think you need? Like if you could get more data, what are you lacking?
Oh, well, I think it's what is the future of these concepts, and I think like you can think about clustering at different vertical levels. So is the clustering that you're doing for the surface the same clustering that you should be doing 100 meters down? This kind of gets to John Paulo's question a little bit in a different way. And I would say that clustering on parent material is different than clustering on land cover information. So you can think about this hierarchy. So I did hierarchies of clustering over the surface, but you could do hierarchies of clustering also in the vertical, right? So you could have this, you could cluster the parent material. So to answer your question, that's a long way to answer it. Parent material. If I could have information that I would like to use in all of this, it would be basically parent material, bedrock, depth to bedrock information that I could actually believe, because I know there are data sets, but whether you can believe it or not is a different story. And much more robust information of the actual canopies. So information about the actual vegetation itself, the canopy sparsities. So how do you actually break it up accordingly? That's information that I would certainly be interested in. And there is information out there for that, but the biggest missing one for sure is the parent material. I think there's, what is a typical number of clusters? So John Paulo, what is the typical number of clusters you use in a hilly grid box versus flat agriculture grid box? It's a great question. In GFDL, where we've done this, because we basically needed to come up with an optimal number of clusters, we came up with, we first predefined what is the number of clusters that we can do on average over the globe, and it was like 20 or 30 max. And so then using that, we leveraged how we would split it up. And the short answer is over the plains, over agriculture areas, it was like 4 or 5. But over mountainous areas with a lot of heterogeneity, you could get up to like 800, right? So if you want to actually account for all the heterogeneity, you have to have flexible representations of the different sources. So not every 25-kilometer box is the same, which is what John Paulo's question is getting at.
Great.
Yep.
Are there any last questions, or shall we wrap it up? Okay, I feel we've given everyone a chance.
Sounds
But
good.
thank you so much, Nate. It was very interesting.
Yeah,
I'm excited to see the future, and yeah, interested to see what happens at the Pangloss conference. It sounds like there'll be some good discussions and some interesting outcomes.
absolutely. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.